All right, great. Okay, so thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Shelley O'Toole. I'm the hazard mitigation grant supervisor for MEMA. I'm joined by Dave Woodbury, who's the hazard mitigation grants coordinator, Beth Dubrowski, who is our grant support unit helper and coordinator, and we have Mike Enko, who is our civil engineer in the mitigation unit, and Jeff Sukowski, who is the state hazard mitigation planner for your local hazard mitigation plans. All right, let's get started. So what will we cover today? So we'll cover the contract package, procurement, the scope of work for your project, how to submit your plan, your quarterly reporting requirements, reimbursements and cost share information, and then any modifications. So there are several parties involved in your grant. So we'll describe them here. So FEMA is the federal agency that provides the funding. So they're the ones with the money. The recipient, that's us, that's MEMA, the state. We're the non-federal entity, and we receive the federal award directly from FEMA. And then we move on to the subrecipient, which is you, the community. You're the non-federal entity that will receive the subaward from the recipient. So the money comes from FEMA, goes to MEMA, and then we send it on to you through the state contract. The contractor, that's the entity that receives the contract as defined in 200.22, and that is the entity that will be essentially conducting the planning process. All right, there's more terms involved. So your particular grant is funded through HMGP Hazard Mitigation Grant Program Disaster 4496, which is the COVID disaster. The grant or award is meaning that MEMA has received federal grant awards to fund the plans, and we manage these grants with FEMA. We're responsible for all subawards. The subgrant or the subaward is when MEMA breaks up our grants into subgrants. So each of you has a subgrant to this one FEMA grant. The state contract, that's the mechanism or the legal arrangement between the state and the community to allow for us to work with you and provide funding for your planning project. The vendor contract or agreement, that is your agreement between your community and the vendor, and that will actually complete the planning process. The contractor. So the contractor is the vendor providing goods or services that will directly benefit the subrecipient. So you will need to go out to bid. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But the contractor is your vendor. In some cases, it's the regional planning agency. Sometimes it's a consultant or consulting firm. So they will provide the goods and services for conducting the planning process. And in most cases, I believe all cases in this grant, it's a hazard mitigation plan update or a new hazard mitigation plan. State contract package, excuse me. So that state contract package that was sent out to you, and many of you have already returned that. That includes instructions to complete the contract package. Many of you have returned them to us, so thank you very much for that. That contract includes the terms and conditions, the scope of work, budget information, work schedule, and more. You've also all been asked to designate a project manager. So the project manager must be assigned to this project. And if at any point you need to change that project manager, you just need to let us know and we can revise the contract. I will turn it over to Dave now for federal procurement.
Thanks, Shelley. Good morning, everyone. Shelley, can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Perfect. So I just wanted to cover a couple of slides with you all regarding procurement for the grants. Because this is a federal grant, it does fall under federal procurement requirements. And just a couple of things to keep in mind is that the community, should be responsible for going through the procurement process, and we'll assist with that to make sure that you're procuring the grant and the contractor in accordance with local, state, and federal regulations. We have a couple of documents on our website that we have a link here for sharing that information. Quick slide on so what we'll do is we'll go over the different procurement types. The first type is micro purchase procedures. This is for under $10,000 total cost. So none of our grants are eligible under this grant. So essentially, we can move on to the next slide. So everyone will fall under the small purchase procedures. This is also found under 2 CFR 200.320. It's essentially procurement under $250,000. And then, so what this involves is price or rate quotations, essentially from an adequate number of sources, and essentially that's at least three firms that you'll want to reach out to, or three contractors. And then part of that process is documenting that history, whether you called all the contractors or emailed or put out an RFQ, RFP. There's documentation involved with that process. And just a few things to remember. So what you'll want to do again is document it in writing or by email, at least three sources. You'll want to include the scope of work that we've included in our contract package for you, just so that everyone has that standard scope of work language. You'll want to include all the necessary affirmative steps in that process, i.e. minority business, WBE, that language that you'll want to include. It's not a matter of the lowest bidder type of thing or sealed bid. It's the most responsive and responsible firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the community. So you'll just go through and document that information. There's also a number of contract clauses that a lot of your procurement officers will know to include in that language as well, such as termination clause, the EEO clauses, etc., debarment, suspension, and anti-lobbying. And then that was a lot of information, I think, in the last couple of minutes here. So if anybody has any questions on procurement, we definitely would like to hear from you. Again, it's not just state procurement, it's federal procurement that also has to be followed. Great.
Good morning, everybody. Go ahead, David.
I was going to turn it over to Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Zukowski, and I'm the local hazard mitigation planner with MEMA. And today I'm going to talk about the tasks that are in your scope of work, as well as how to submit a plan for the review process. So task 1, grant award and contracting. Everybody on the webinar should have received their grant contract paperwork from Ms. Dubrowski. If you haven't done so, please sign and return that, and then you'll get your notice to proceed. Once you receive that notice to proceed, the next step is to select and hire a vendor for the following the procurement guidelines that were talked about in the previous slides. Task 3 is to convene a hazard mitigation planning committee. If this is the community's first time in the planning process, you want to bring together the folks in your community who have the knowledge about the programs, the policies, and resources that keep your community safe. Some of those examples of folks would include your town and city planners, your emergency management, land use and development folk, your Board of Health, and community lifelines, just to name a few. Involving members from these key sectors in the planning process will result in a shared and understanding of risks. It will also help build a widespread support for directing your financial, technical, and human resources towards the natural hazard risk reduction. Task 4, you want to revisit the hazard profiles for each of your hazards. The intent here is to understand the potential hazards that affect the planning area in order to identify which hazard risks are most significant and which locations are most adversely affected. Just for reference, all of these hazards that affect the Commonwealth are addressed in the 2023 Resilient Mass Plan. The next task is to conduct a facility inventory. The planning committee will want to identify all the essential facilities within the community that you want to protect. Some of these critical facilities include your hospitals, your police and fire stations, the EOC, your shelters, pumping stations, your schools, gas, electrical, and communities, communication systems. Task 6 is to summarize the vulnerability. Vulnerable assets and potential losses are more than just the list of total exposure of populations, structures, and critical facilities in the planning area. An example of an overall summary is a list of key issues or problem statements that clearly describe the community's greatest vulnerabilities that will be addressed in the mitigation strategy. Your next step is to identify the mitigation goals. The plan must include a general hazard mitigation goals that represent the community, what the community seeks to accomplish throughout the plan. Goals are basically broad policy statements that explain what is to be achieved, and they must be consistent with the hazards identified in the plan. Actions. The plan must include a mitigation strategy that analyzes actions and projects that the community considered to reduce the impacts of hazards identified in the risk assessment. The plan must also identify the actions or projects that the jurisdiction intends to implement. Task 9 is the plan review, evaluation, and implementation. This task is for plan updates only. So the intent of this task is to ensure that the mitigation strategy continues to address the risk and vulnerabilities to existing and potential development, and that it takes into consideration the possible future conditions that can impact the vulnerability of the community. Plan maintenance. There must be a description of the method and schedule for keeping the plan current to include monitoring, evaluating, and updating the mitigation plan in a 5-year cycle. The public review of the draft plan. The plan must document how the public was involved in the planning process during the drafting stage. And last but not least is task 12, review and approval. Once I receive and review the plan and feel that all the requirements are met, I will send the plan to FEMA for their review. If revisions are to be made, the plan is returned to community and their respective vendor. Once the requirements are met, FEMA issues an APA, which is approval pending adoption, and the community then adopts the plan and forwards the resolution to me, and I will forward that to FEMA for approval. Once approved, the community is eligible for HMA grants as funding becomes available for the next 5 years from the approval date. I just want to be very clear right now, when all plans must meet the local mitigation planning policy guidance that went into effect last April. Next slide, please. Some of the summary changes that went into effect in the planning policy guide. It defines who the local governments must include in the planning process. What FEMA wants to see is a robust planning process here, giving the opportunity for all to be involved. Different communities may necessitate targeted outreach and engagement, especially underserved communities. So what you want to invite is your businesses, your academia, and other private organizations that you want to include. You'd also want your nonprofits, community-based organizations that will support those underserved communities. Requires local governments to include effects of climate change and other future conditions. So your risk assessments are not a static part of the plan, and conditions such as your climate, your population demographics, and land use change over time, and risk assessments need to consider how these changes will alter the jurisdiction's vulnerabilities. What you also want to see is the important role of adopting and enforcing building codes. You want to see, FEMA wants to see a narrative on the community's existing building codes and land use and development ordinances and regulations throughout the plan. Strong alignment with your NFIP. There's a list of criteria that they're looking for to see with your NFIP. It also includes if the community is looking to reach out and apply for high hazard potential planning grants, there's a list of criteria that also has to be met. Next slide, please. How to submit a plan to MEMA for approval. We've got a mitigation mailbox as well as CC me, and I will file the documents respectively, and the plans get reviewed in order that they are received. Next slide, please. Couple planning resources for your fingertips. These can be found on our homepage, local hazard mitigation planning documents. It also involves all the new planning policy guidance that were released last April for you to find. Any questions that can be reached, call me anytime, and we're more than happy to help you. I'll turn it over to Beth so she can continue the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Checking you can hear me okay, Shelley? Good, thank you. Okay, before I keep going, any questions to this point? If you do have any, you can click the raise hand button or put them in the chat, or feel free to take yourself off unmute and ask a question if you would like to, as I'm going through my part of the presentation. So I'm going to start with the quarterly reporting requirement. So quarterly reports are required under the terms and conditions. Actually, I just saw a question about project manager. Before I go further, let's address that, because the project manager plays a big role. Shelley, do you want to address that question?
Sure. So the project manager is the person designated by the community on who will be in charge of the day-to-day, operations of the project. So your vendor will be conducting the planning process, of course, but your project manager is the person in the community, which will be our primary point of contact on the project, will be responsible for submitting the quarterly reports, submitting the drafts, that type of thing. So it's basically the main point of contact for the community. Did that answer your question, I hope?
Okay. All right. So then back to quarterly reports, because this is the responsibility of the project manager. You as the project manager, you'll be the point person that we're looking to for the quarterly reports to be submitted. As I said, these are identified as a requirement under the terms and conditions of the state contract. Quarterly reports are due as of the 30th at the end of the quarter. FEMA sets every quarter end as the 30th, regardless of how many days in the month. And the reports are due to me on the first of the month following quarter end. So particularly around holiday periods, 4th of July, Christmas, New Year's, plan on preparing your quarterly reports and submitting them prior to the 30th, because they really are due to us on the 1st. We have to compile these for all of our subrecipients and turn them over to FEMA. Any information put in the quarterly reports not only gets reviewed internally by MEMA, by our team for project management, but it also gets reviewed by FEMA Region 1 and FEMA headquarters. So these really are a critical part of your state contract process. I will send reminders about the quarterly reports. I send them out about 15 days prior to the due date. The reminder only goes to the project manager who is listed, but I can certainly add additional people to that list if you want the reminders to go to multiple people. If you want the reminder to go to your vendor because you're going to have them put together the quarterly report, then I can certainly add them as a reminder. To that point, if you're looking for quarterly reports, data from your vendors in order to complete your reports, make sure that you set their deadline earlier than the 30th. Make sure they have their quarter end information to you, by around the 20th or something, to give you time to review that and then prepare the quarterly report. For everybody on this call, the first quarterly report that you will be responsible for completing will be as of March 30th, 2024, and it will be due to me on April 1st. Those get submitted by email, Word document. I will provide a draft of the document to you with all of the appropriate information filled out as a starting point for you. Those will get sent out to you at some point after the state contracts are executed and you've been issued a notice to proceed. I'll send it to you in a Word format so that you can easily update it, and then you can submit either as a Word or PDF, whichever you prefer. So this is the quarterly report, page 1 and 2 of the quarterly report. You'll note that the individual line items in the tasks, those are the same tasks that are in the schedule and the scope of work that are part of your state contract. The start and end dates that are shown here on this sample are not correct for your grants. Your end date for all of these projects is May 1 of 2026. So the drafts that I send you will have the appropriate dates as they correspond to your state contract schedule. As you submit each quarter's report, we're looking for you to update the status code and cost code that are at the top of the box. Those codes are found down at the bottom of page 1. So you need to tell us, is the project on schedule? Is it going to be delayed for any reason? And then cost code, based on your procurement and the vendor you hire, is the cost unchanged from your original budget, or will they be overrun, underrun? Looking at the task start and end date columns, you'll want to update those to tell us what's actually been completed or what your target dates are as the project moves forward. And then for each task line item, you need to provide a % complete. So, for anyone, as soon as you get your notice to proceed after the state contracts are finalized, then your grant award state contracting line item will switch to 100% complete. Down at the bottom of page 1, total percentage of project complete there's no hard and fast formula for this. It's your estimate of how far along the project is moving each quarter. So, based on the work you're doing with your vendor and how things are going, you'll assign an overall project complete percentage. At the top of page 2, we're looking for brief comments in box 1 as to what tasks have been completed and the key things that have been done only during the current reporting quarter. So hiring your vendor, starting, your first committee kickoff meeting. Those are things that we want to hear about. And then answer the rest of the questions on page 2. If there are going to be any delays, you want to identify them here. If there's, a cost change, you want to identify it. There is an item, question number 4, about request for change in scope. There are very, very limited times when planning grants would have a change in scope. With these, there is not the possibility to change the scope. Any change would mean a completely new project. So that would not apply for this group of planning grants. And then extension of performance period if you've had delays. Anything you put on this page for issues that might come up with, timing, with hiring a vendor, with, if you have a change in staff in the town or anything, any of those issues, you'll put them on here, but you also want to be talking to the grant coordinator here at MEMA, so either Dave or Shelley or Jeff, to let them know and give them a heads up that there is an issue with the project. Task item number 2 is select and hire a vendor. Dave talked to you about the procurement for the project. As soon as your vendor is hired, we will be looking for you to send us all of the procurement documentation. So the documentation on how bids were solicited, a determination on or explanation of how the vendor was hired. And that could be as simple as an email to us saying, we solicited bids from these 3 vendors. We only got back quotes from this one. Based on that, that's who we hired. We're not looking, again, you don't have to go through sealed bids on this, so it's a little bit more informal, but it does have to be documented. And so as soon as that task has been completed, we'll be looking for that documentation. If we see it completed on the quarterly report, you'll get an email from one of us asking for you to send us all of that documentation. Questions on the quarterly reports before I move forward? Did I just see a question pop up and disappear?
Yes, there is a question. Are you approving the vendor or just reviewing the procedure? We're reviewing the procurement procedure. So it's up to you to determine whether or not your vendor is appropriate for the work.
Okay. All right, so moving on to reimbursements. Because you're doing the work, you want to get the money back. So again, once the state contract has been finalized and you've been issued a notice to proceed, shortly after that, I will send you out a package that will include draft reimbursement documentation. It will include a draft request for funds form and some checklists for you to follow. And so when you get those, take a look at them and we can address any questions you might have about them at that point. For reimbursement documentation, there's basically, a couple of key items. There'll be a cover sheet, a request for funds form that gets signed by the authorized signatory for the town. And that authorized signatory is the individual who was named on the contractor authorized signatory listing as part of the state contract as an authorized signer for the state contract. They're the ones that will also sign and certify the request for funds form and a couple of other documents. Along with that request for funds form, you'll have an invoice summary that's just a list of all of the vendor invoices that are included. You'll provide backup documentation, proof of payment, and then other documents as required. And I'll go into each one of those a little bit more. Under the other documents as required, a key point is that we cannot issue full and final reimbursement on the project until your plan has received formal approval from FEMA. So that means all the way through the approval process, review and approval by Jeff and FEMA, FEMA issuing approval pending adoption, the town doing the adoption, and then FEMA issuing the formal approval letter. Once that has happened, then we can issue full and final reimbursement. That doesn't mean we can't do partial reimbursements prior to that point, but we will do a holdback of, at least 10% prior to receiving formal approval. Before any reimbursements are done, we must have procurement documentation. So that's, again, we keep coming back to the procurement. That's the first thing, before anything else happens. Once you get your state contract notice to proceed, you've got to do that piece of it. And, that triggers the ability for anything else to move forward. The other thing regarding reimbursements and quarterly reports, they do tie together because when we do the reimbursements, we look back at the last quarterly report to see how far along your reporting the project is. So we won't be able to, for example, we wouldn't be able to reimburse 50% of the available federal funds if you're reporting that the project is only, 10 or 15% moved forward. So keep that in mind as you're doing your quarterly reports, that, based on how much your vendor has invoiced you, how far along the process is, you want to try to keep your percentages valid in line with what's happening, because those percentages will affect the reimbursements. The other thing with the reimbursements is in your state contract package on the budget page, we've allocated the federal funds across the fiscal years that we expect the project to be open. And so with a contract end date of May of 2026, that means that the federal funds have been allocated into fiscal year 24, 25, and 26. That's state and local fiscal years, not federal fiscal years. As you're looking for reimbursement of funds, if you are looking for periodic reimbursements as the project moves forward, we will not be able to reimburse more than has been allocated into that particular fiscal year without doing a budget amendment. So if your project is moving along faster than the current schedule suggests that it would be, that's great, because we obviously want to see you get the projects done as quickly as possible. But just keep in mind that I will have to do a budget amendment before I can do a reimbursement if you're looking for a higher amount than has been allocated to the fiscal year. And we can address that. It's very easy to do. It comes into play around May and June at the end of each fiscal year, because we'd need to have a sufficient amount of time to do those budget amendments before we reimburse you if your town accountants are looking for money back by June 30th. So keep that in mind. Okay, so the request for funds form is this form right here. Again, as I said, I'll give you a draft form that has all of the community's specific information and dollar amounts filled in on the form. The line items, again, tie to the scope of work and the schedule and the budget that are included in your state contract. And so these budget line items have been approved by FEMA as part of the project approval, and then we have to implement it as part of the state contract. So I would strongly recommend that when you're trying to hire your vendors, as I think it was Dave said, you want to give them the scope of work so that they know specifically what the scope is. You also want to make sure that they know that you'll need to process your reimbursement request according to these line items and these dollar amounts. And so you want them to invoice you according to these line items. Because if they don't, it's going to be very difficult to break down the amounts and put them into these line items on the request for funds form. We do have the ability to move funds around in between these line items if you find that, you know, perhaps task 5, your critical facility inventory, is going to take much more time than has been allocated, and a higher dollar amount that's been allocated, and, you know, maybe a different line item is going to be less. We can reallocate, but we need to know about it in advance. So again, this comes back to your procurement, your vendor contract. You know, look at these line items when you get your vendor contract and are signing that to make sure that you can easily put the vendor amounts into these categories. The other thing is, for those of you who are using local staff time as your 10% cost share match, your staff time will also have to be allocated into these individual line items. So I can't stress enough, start tracking your time right from the start of the project. You don't want to have to go back and try to figure out, you know, what members of your committee worked on what tasks. You know, when you're submitting for a reimbursement request 6 months or a year down the road, you want to make sure that you're adequately tracking the dates of work, the hours of work, and the tasks that are being done so that they can be logged and applied to the appropriate activity line items on your request for funds. Does anybody have questions about that issue before I move forward? No? Okay. A couple of just minor things on this form. Column B, the total of all costs paid to date, that column represents the total of your vendor costs plus your cost share, your 10% cost share. So either cash or your staff time. In the case of a cash match, this column is just going to be your vendor costs. In the case of staff time match, this column will be your vendor cost plus the staff time total that has been contributed to date on each reimbursement request. Under column D, your federal share being requested, that amount can only be up to 90% of the total costs in column B, or up to the total federal share available. So it can't exceed the federal share available in column C, and it can't be more than 90% of of the expenses that have been incurred. All of these, when you go to do your first request for funds, I'm happy to talk through it with you, look at a draft, look at the backup documentation before you finalize anything and get signatures on it. Quickly, we'll talk about your backup documents. So proof of your costs, what's approved in the scope of work in the contract. So that's going to be your invoices from the vendor. You want to make sure that their invoices are very clear, that they show the start and end dates for the work included in each invoice. If there are any direct expenses, you want to make sure those are broken down. You know, as much detail as possible on your vendor invoices. And then your proof of your municipal cost share. Again, if it's cash, then we just want to see that the money's coming out of a general ledger account, a general appropriation. It cannot be any federal funds. So make sure that any cash that's being used as your cost share, if you have a cash match, that is local appropriations or state funds, but cannot be any federal source. We'll come back to the cost share for town staff in just a minute. Proof of payment, we need either canceled checks that were issued to your vendors or a municipal printout showing the payment. Most of the towns that I have dealt with are able to provide a printout showing the check or electronic transfer to the vendor with a date, the vendor name, the amount, and the general ledger account it's coming from. If your cost share is coming from staff time, then we will be looking for payroll reports for the employees who are included because we have to validate the salary rate. So to talk about the cost share for just a minute. The cost share that was identified in the letter of intent for the application and approved by FEMA is the cost share that must be used. If you feel that you're going to have to change that, then it has to be pre-approved before you move forward. So if you said that you thought you would use staff time and you've decided that there was an appropriation at town meeting and you just want to use cash so that you don't have to track staff time, we can do that, but we do have to submit a request back to FEMA for approval, and that can take a little bit of time to do. So we'd need that request in writing, and we need to know that it's going to happen. So we talked about town cash. Your in-kind services can come from either municipal employees or volunteers. You have to be able to document everything. As I said, start tracking the time and the tasks, right away. If you do have we consider volunteers committee members. So if you have Conservation Commission board members working on your committee, they would be considered a volunteer because they don't get an hourly pay rate from the town. They get a stipend. So anyone like that would be considered a volunteer. If you bring in any community members who are someone with environmental experience or someone with planning experience, then they can be included. Again, they would be included as a volunteer. You have to determine a volunteer rate, and that can, there's a lot of ways that can be done. There are national charts for volunteer rates for federal grants. A lot of committees will average the town staff salaries of the town staff that's included in the committee and use that as your volunteer rate. Again, there's different ways you can do it, but you have to document how it's done, and that has to be certified by an authorized signatory for the town. The in-kind services, the municipal employees, again, that has to be certified by the authorized signatory for the town. And it's got to be someone who can authorize and certify pay rates. So your town accountant, your town administrator, mayor, board of selectmen chair. This is a sample spreadsheet that I provide, and I will give this to you in an Excel format when I send out the reimbursement documents. This is one way that you could track staff time. You don't have to use this, but you need to use something that can adequately show us the staff member name, the date of work, the task they did, the task from the schedule, and then specifically the work they did within that task. And then the number of hours, their salary rate. Make sure that salary rates correspond exactly to the salary rate that will be shown on payroll reports, because those are double checked. They are cross checked. Don't round salary rates for purpose of reporting, because then it won't match payroll. Make sure you get new salary rates and change them over at fiscal year changeovers if there are raises that have gone through. Let's see, fringe. You can include fringe. We have to have a statement from your chief financial officer, town accountant, whoever in your particular town can establishes that and can certify it. We do have to have a statement certifying what the fringe rate is, and that can be added to the salary for total cost. This is the certification form that I mentioned. This, if you give us the spreadsheet with the detail, then that detail can be rolled up to totals on this page so that you just list each employee and the total of the match that's being included for that reporting period. Again, if you're using volunteers, the volunteer rate would be shown on here. And again, this would be signed by the authorized signatory for the municipality. And that's all I've got on reimbursements. Again, I'm happy to look at drafts. I'm happy to look at, if you want to put together a draft package as you get started on the project. I can look at the reports that you provide as far as payroll reports and vendor payment reports, make sure that those are going to fit the needs, and so we won't have any issues down the road. So, any other questions on reimbursements? No? All right, I'll turn it back to Shelley.
Great, thank you, Beth. So as Beth mentioned, there's very little room for modifications on these grants since you are using the funds to update or develop a hazard mitigation plan. There are two instances where you can have modifications, and that's in the budget or cost share source, and then in the period of performance. So for either one of these, we will need to have a grant modification form filled out. And as soon as you know that you're going to either need more time or you're looking to change your budget line items or your cost share source, please let us know and we can get you started with that. A lot of times this has to go to FEMA for review and approval, so it will take some time. So as soon as you know, if you could let us know, that will be helpful to all of us. And any questions that we haven't covered so far? Just two main things I want to just, reiterate. Any changes, please let us know. Notifying us early helps all of us in the long run and helps us with closeout. And then procurement, that is one of the main items that we do need to focus on. A lot of communities are under the false impression that these grants can just be handed to their regional planning agencies, and that is not the case because we are using federal funds. So in that case, as Dave described, the federal procurement rules do apply. So we do need to make sure that we are conducting that procurement process. It doesn't need to be, a really involved procurement process. As Dave mentioned, it's the small procurement procedures, but we do need to follow that procedure and have that documentation in place in order to provide reimbursement. With that, any other questions about anything, please feel free to type it in the chat, raise your hand, take yourself off mute.
Shelley, if I could add one more thing.
Please.
Just where we stand in the process for all of you that have sent me back your state contracts. Sorry,
Yeah.
I should have addressed that up front. For anybody that I've got your state contracts back already, they're in our processing cycle. So they're either getting countersigned by our director, or some of them have moved over to our fiscal unit for set up in the state system. As soon as I have those back from our fiscal unit, I will be issuing a notice to proceed, and that notice to proceed will give you a start date for the date that eligible expenses can be incurred. So within the next week to 2 weeks, as those trickle back to me from our fiscal department, I'll be starting to issue notice to proceed on those. And I will return to you a copy of the fully countersigned executed contract as well. And then, within a couple of weeks after that, then I'll follow up with quarterly report drafts and reimbursement drafts. So that's where the process stands right now.
Great, thanks, Beth. Just a couple questions came in the chat. So the PowerPoint will be available. We'll be sending out the slides at some point today or tomorrow. And is there a list of experienced vendors? We're not technically allowed to provide specific vendor names, but we would encourage you to speak to your neighboring communities and see who they used, who they may or who they, enjoyed working with, maybe not enjoyed working with. As always, your regional planning agencies are eligible. We just need to make sure that we follow through with that procurement procedure. Any other questions? All right, well, if you think of anything else, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're here to answer any questions. And we look forward to working with you to develop those plans. Thanks, everybody.